So we have some great sessions coming up for you today. And this morning is going to focus on sort of CDMO capacity, global supply chain, manufacturing, all those kind of topics. So our first presenter is Brian Barbash, who is the partner at Pharosity Consulting, an Argano Company. And he is going to present for us this morning on strategic operations and analysis, realizing integrated planning and gross to net. So could we please give him a warm welcome? Thank you.
All right. Thank you, and thanks everybody for taking some time this morning to join us here. As Eden said, I'm a partner at Argano, which is the parent of Pharosity Consulting. And just to give you a little bit of a background on who we are, in case you are unfamiliar. Pharosity Consulting, we've spent the last 10 years as an independent company and recently acquired by Argano. And leading up to that, spent our careers in the contracting and pricing, financial operations, commercial operations for life sciences companies. We've gotten really all of those components within contracting and pricing. When I bring up the slide here, it'll be right there. The right one, thank you. I must be just out of range. There we go. So a basis in commercial contracting, government pricing programs, performance analytics, that sets the foundation for a lot of the work, the topics I'm going to talk about today, which is really around the gross to net ecosystem, modeling, and operations. And so building on all of that, what we have is all of that information flows downstream into this concept of integrated planning. And I'll talk about that from the perspective of what do we have from a small to emerging pharma, what it looks like in large pharma, and some of the key sort of light bulb moments for folks, for manufacturers who've gone down this path and realized some results. So what do we talk about when we mean operational strategy and gross to net as an overall topic? For us, it really starts with, and I would hope most of you here as well, with the patient journey. And that defines for us what's their experience going to be like, how are they going to access the various therapies that they're going to be on. What that translates to now as a manufacturer, we really kind of, if we follow this circle here, we split into two areas. We have our access strategies, which helps us understand who are we selling to and through, how are we getting that strategy in place and getting the product out to the patient. And then depending on the disease state, depending on the type of therapy that they're going to be on, what are the ancillary services and other components that are going to help support the patient through that journey. And you bring these things together to ultimately create your, for our perspective in finance operations, contracting and pricing, what are those access strategies? When you put all that together, that creates an operational strategy. How are we going to enable a manufacturer to be able to execute on those, be able to track its performance, understand are we successful, where do we need to make adjustments, and how is that going to move forward? Who do we work with? How do we structure the organization? And most important, or very importantly too, the tools, the technologies, and the capabilities we need. So through that lens, we have to think about this from the standpoint of 4 or 5 distinct pillars of capability. We start with policy. I don't mean policy necessarily from the standpoint of regulatory policy or governmental policy, but that certainly influences what we're doing. I'm talking about within a manufacturer, within your operations, what are the guardrails? And is that clearly articulated so that everyone's ultimately operating from the same playbook? If we think about different pricing and contracting strategies, you have teams that are out there from a market access perspective, looking and communicating with different payers, different stakeholders. We really need to avoid rogue folks kind of trying to win the business, all well-intentioned, but doing some things that may be on the other end of it, say for best price for Medicaid or affecting 340B utilization. I see some nodding heads. So that's where the policy really comes into play. From that, we now have process. So if we know the guardrails, the process defines exactly how do we execute against that policy. It needs to be clearly defined. We're establishing standard operating procedures, but most importantly, exceptions, because they always happen, and we need to be able to deal with those exceptions. From there, we talk about the organization, and what we mean by that is right-sized. I'm not talking about making sure headcount is up or down. It's really who's deployed in the various functions most effectively. We want to get out of the rote administrative tasks and make sure we're focused on higher value analytical tasks and things that are directly contributing to the overall strategy. And that's from an organizational structure, that's what we mean by that, which is then enabled by automation. And we really want to make sure here we're being pragmatic. You know, depending on where you are from a a life cycle as a company, if we're talking about automation for small and emerging, that looks very different than automation for large pharma and those types of organizations. And you'll hear me talk a little bit later about it's perfectly fine to use desktop tools and capabilities with the right guardrails to get things operationalized properly, compared to what you're going to be using with maybe larger platforms and capabilities within large pharma. And there's a reason data's on the bottom of this slide, because it's the foundation for everything. Good data, clean data, quality data is really absolutely critical to having a successful operation. And whether we're talking about gross net ecosystem, which I'll mention in a minute, regular contract operations, market access strategy enablement, performance management, all of these things are built on a foundation of good data. And there are ways to get there. Again, it's going to look different from small to mid-size to large manufacturers. So now we understand kind of where we think about just broadly, operationally, for us, gross to net, it's really a set of functions within this broader mosaic of activities. And this is just an example. This is clearly not everything that happens within life sciences within a manufacturer, but for us, where we focus most of our time in the commercial space, you can see some things highlighting. We're really talking about gross net. It's a core set of functions within that ecosystem. So we talk about demand forecasting, pre-deal analysis, gross to net channel forecasting, accruals, and post-deal. And each of those functions individually serve unique purposes, but they're very much connected. There's a reason we use the honeycomb slide here as an illustration. For those of you that maybe I've talked to before, we use gears too. That's another really good one because it really shows how things interact. So when we talk about demand forecasting, just to level set, that's really volume-based forecasting, understanding what's the total picture of product in the marketplace. And there might be things like market events, analogs, and different elements that build up that forecast. But it establishes the baseline from which we then do really two things. We have pre-deal, which is the concept of looking at individual market access deals that are forthcoming. What are the different scenarios that you might be running, the different terms that you might be modeling, looking at it from a very focused lens on a specific entity, whether it's a payer, an institution, what have you. Versus gross to net, which is the portfolio, and I mean portfolio from the customer standpoint of all the elements of all of your deals, who you're selling to and through, to get from total gross sales through all the discount liabilities that you're going to have in the commercial space, the impacts on the government channels and any of the ancillary services and trade and distribution, down to what is ultimately net sales, which then feeds into establishing my accrual and my reserve. And that's all about the finance operation. What do we have? What do we need? What's the true up? What's the long-term outlook? And where do we need to, what do we need to push back into our point of sale accrual system so they have the appropriate rates? And then finally, kind of hanging out here on the right, but it is equally important, and it's really, you could argue this wraps around the whole thing, and that's really the performance monitoring of everything that's going on. It's specifically listed for post-deal, and usually when we talk about it, that means those individual deals that we've talked about in the pre-deal side, we're going to look and see, did we get what we expected? That's the most basic and simplest question that you start with, and from there, we try to hold ourselves accountable to a point to see, is that strategy really working? So post-deal actually will shift from the individual deal, because that deal over time, it gets signed, you get a year out. Now I'm really in the gross to net world where I'm looking at a little bit of a longer time horizon. I'm taking that performance monitoring and applying it to forecasts and understanding where do we stand. Again, are our assumptions correct? Are there anomalies we need to be aware of? Are there some early warning signs that we need to be looking out for? So this is that portfolio of services that we think about when it comes to gross to net. Let's talk about a little bit of kind of real world examples. I'm going to share a few situations here too, where we've worked with various manufacturers. I'm going to have a emerging pharma example, maybe, and a large pharma. I want to just talk about where did they start, what did they do, and kind of some things that really were light bulb moments for them through the process. For an emerging pharma, we have a situation where we had a company that's looking for about 3 brands. They need to establish their forecast for finance and pressure test various assumptions. And so some examples, thinking about discounting in certain channels. This happened to be a Part B drug, and they were looking at potentially offering some incentives to to various physician providers, and they wanted to understand what happens over the long term if we introduce that now. Where is reimbursement going to go? And if I decide to unwind that discount, how long does it take to work its way out of my reimbursement process? Because those of you who may not be familiar, ASP is very heavily dictated on, ASP being the basis for reimbursement in Part B, very heavily influenced by how discounts flow, and it's included in the average calculation. And because of the way the government defines that calculation, if you remove that discount, it still hangs around for about 12 months, and it has to roll along until it eventually disappears. So like I said, we had a mix of, in that organization, we had a mix of in-house teams. We had some outsourced service providers all gathering data and providing that to the organization, which is a pretty typical, I think, footprint for an emerging company. So in this case, again, think about those pillars that we talked about. We established policies and procedures, and we made sure that teams were aware and operating against them. Another really important piece is standardizing a forecasting approach and gathering that data together. Now, even in an emerging space where you're dealing with desktop capabilities, Excel, access databases, what have you, throughout the organization, having these guardrails actually improves the environment, and it makes those tools much more sustainable in the organization, much more effective operating together. And when you put that with these models, in this case we have fit-for-purpose Excel models that are able to calculate the various forecasts and look at the results and then produce outputs that folks within the organization were used to seeing. I'm sure everybody here has taken a pivot table or a chart and dropped it in a PowerPoint slide. How many times, I would ask yourself, how many times do you recreate the same thing, or do I drag and drop new data in? I'm constantly doing this on a regular basis. Even with the tools like this, we can get to a point, if we have a good, well-defined process, to make that a little more automated and save some time so you're focused on the analysis. And that's what we were able to accomplish here and pull all that together. But what was it about the process, once we put that in place, what were the things that kind of really lit up for them as they went through this improvement process? I think the first is the realization that from a structure, having something more structured and governed really sets a couple of things. It led to more discipline on the pricing side. So I talked about some of the folks who are really, with good intentions, earning the business, making good value propositions. But now with this structure in place, there are guardrails to help them understand where do they need to be working with pricing committee folks, with governance folks, and forecasters and modelers to say, okay, if we do this, what's my impact on, in this case, ASP? It also allowed them to establish foundational elements. So what I mean by that is the organization will continue to grow. Ideally, we're launching more products, we have volume increasing, and we're growing as a business, we're serving more patients. If I have this foundation in place, and that's what they were able to realize, is that we've really established something we can build on. Even if we continue down the path of using our desktop tools and Excel-based capability, I've got structures that it can absorb and scale. And then when the time comes, when we're going to look to move to more capable platforms and bigger scale processes, I now have something to build on and I can expand and adapt, as opposed to scrambling, trying to figure out how it all works, to then put in something totally new. And then they really understood, from a collaboration standpoint, they had some standardized processes. Folks are talking to each other on a regular basis. They see anomalies in forecasts, they see things that are happening a little bit differently than they expect, or that question, how long is it going to take me to unwind this particular strategy so that we can see the impact? That's fostering communications between contract operations, who have to manage the teams that are executing, the market access strategy folks who need to understand what the true impact is, and the forecasting and the finance teams, as they have to account for that through their processes. And this story here is actually very similar, especially on the standardization process between small and large pharma. So in this case, in a large manufacturer now, we are in that situation. We've totally outgrown what we can do in Excel. It is not uncommon to walk into a place, and I suspect folks here are going to say the same thing. There's probably hundreds of Excel sheets rolling around, and workbooks and data handoffs and emails and shared drives. I think we did an analysis of just in a mid-sized company several years ago. I think we calculated and we found 1,700 individual worksheets with over 5,000 individual touch points that they would do in any given quarter to create one forecast. So obviously, we're at a point now in these organizations, we need to reduce the amount of time that takes. We need to standardize tool sets, and we need to get to a point where we can scale really effectively. And on top of that, this manufacturer happened to have a data lake, which is really important. Again, that foundational data element. They had something in place. It was well maintained. It was well curated, but it wasn't being fully utilized. At that point, the assumption was, I have a data lake. What do I do with it? I do analytics. And I look at what happened. It's really an incredible asset to use for not only what happened, but help me understand what's going to happen. So in this case, we talked about standardization with a small manufacturer, kind of the same thing here, right? We now have operational leaders across multiple brands aligning on standard approaches. That's not to say every brand does exactly the same thing. The most important thing about standardization, especially in an organization that's large, that has a diverse portfolio, touching many therapeutic areas, some brands, some specialty, buy and bill versus traditional retail, institutional focused, there needs to be standardization about the approach with the ability to adapt to different requirements for any individual brand. And so once you have those rules in place, now when I find something that goes outside that approach, I can deal with it more effectively. And I don't just have rogue teams running off doing things. The next thing we did is we configured a leading EPM platform, Enterprise Performance Management. These are highly flexible, highly scalable platforms and designed for financial planning. At the end of the day, they are flexible, can really do, if you think about what Excel can do, you can do literally anything in Excel as a modeling exercise. EPM platforms are the same way, but when you put them in place, they are extremely well suited to these use cases, largely because of their scalability, their flexibility, but again, their connected nature and how we share data across them. So once we established those EPM capabilities, we did it across demand forecasting, we did it across gross to net channel forecasting, and we did it across the accruals. And once that platform is in place, we also established common views. We could tell a consistent story to our stakeholders. And we can share that information downstream with relevant individuals. And then we can also publish that downstream, again, back into the data lake, which is the next item here. We're taking advantage of the fact that this now not only becomes a consumer of all of my upstream data, it becomes a publisher, and information can be shared. We aren't recreating all the details of the forecast and the results inside that data lake. We're getting the results that answer business questions out to the right stakeholders. So the further you move away from the folks doing the forecasting, that's when you start to engage with the data layer and the data lakes, and then as you come closer, you're in the EPM platform. At the end of the day, we were able to reduce cycle times from weeks down to days, and our monthly and quarterly closes, we were able to shave 2 days off that process. And again, it's because we got out of the game of collecting data, validating it, and going through that entire exercise, redoing work because we lost it in an email or what have you. So light bulb moments for this large manufacturer, and this happens quite a bit. Earlier detection of risks and anomalies. So now what I have is, because I have a platform that's scalable, it's consuming data from my data lake, it's being published every day, I'm able to see what's happening in, I don't want to say real time, but very close to that on a daily basis. Are we starting to see trend breaks? Are we starting to see what's happening, something that's happening that we didn't expect? Is it enough to say, I need to adjust my assumptions? Or I can say, what happens if this trend break continues? I can very quickly model that. Again, I've reduced that cycle time on the modeling front from weeks down to days, sometimes even hours. And I can do that assessment and understand, and then I can continue to monitor that over time. The connected nature, the whole idea around this process, again, small, but also here in the large manufacturer example, is I need to integrate my processes together. So I'm working on the channel forecasting, gross to net side. I've got questions about demand. I'm now actively engaging those teams. I've got my finance teams operating and creating accruals. They're actively engaged even more now with their channel forecasting partners. And while there may have been communication and collaboration prior to this, it was accelerated, and the content of those conversations changed quite a bit. From, are you sure that number's right, to, this is the number I'm seeing, let's talk about why that happens. Oh, you changed these assumptions. Why did you do that? What's going on? Could a live shift, could be scrubbing in 340B. Any number of things can happen, and we're now able to have those conversations. And I would say, in the last piece here, is that data lake now becomes more visible to broader members of the organization. It is a now more valuable asset. And folks are realizing that it's a clean and trusted source. I can now run analytics off of that, which I would have been doing previously, but when I look at my data now in my forecasting process, and I say, is that number right? I can go to a trusted source and I can confirm that. I can work with teams in market access, I can work with teams in brand, and we're all operating off of the same set of numbers. That proved to be hugely valuable as well, because it got out of the game of questioning, which version do I have? When was the last time you pulled the numbers? Is it the right one coming through email? So that was another really big impact for that organization. All right, so how do we get started? Most importantly, we really need to start with the business questions. What's really hard to answer today? What are the questions that we are also able to consistently answer? Obviously, we need to continue to do that, but try to find your blind spots too. What are the things that being asked I don't necessarily am able to answer, or that takes a ton of work to get to? If you understand your questions, that can guide all of the operational build-out that you need to do, if you think about it. And that's true of what we're talking about here from a gross net and integrated planning, but it's the very foundation of analytics as well. It's all about the business questions. Talking about primary challenges next. One of the key questions we often see is, I'm having a hard time doing this consistently over time. Can I get constant visibility to the drivers? What's changing my outcomes? What are causing the variances? Are we surprised? We have very large manufacturers who come to us and they say, end of the quarter, we have these big swings and we don't understand why. After the swing is over and we've closed the books, we're like, oh, okay, now we can see the variance and what happened. So it goes back to that early detection that I talked about. That's one of the primary drivers here as well. Can we avoid those surprises, and can we adapt to those before they really become a problem? Now we get down, once we've established those foundational elements, we have to define our process. We talked about standardization a minute ago, but most importantly, who are the stakeholders, who are the owners? Let's get those identified. Who are the savants? Every organization has them. They're the wizards at the process, they're the wizards at the tool, they're the ones who know all the little nuances, and they probably know the nuances of every other person on the team. They're the ones you have to track down, they're the ones you have to find and get information from, because they're going to help really drive it. And then what's the natural flow of the process? It's one thing to map it out on paper and to understand from an organizational standpoint what it's supposed to look like, but then get into the trenches and see what really happens. Where are the handoffs? Who are the ones that are helping folks out side by side? What's the real flow? And can we elevate that to something that's standardized and more collaborative? And then finally, again, back to data as a foundation. You have to understand it. But really what's critical here is not only can we get to it and make sure it's not cobbled together, and one thing I did not write up here is the questions that you're being asked, can the data you have answer them? And if it can't, you have to identify ways to close those gaps, or perhaps change the way in which you answer the question to help tell the full story and supplement it. Now, from the standpoint of solutions, again, there's a spectrum here, and we talk about the different types of capabilities that are out in the marketplace. We find that they fall into generally three categories. Desktop tools, we've already talked about those. Those are your Excel capabilities, Access, what have you, spreadsheets. They're really organizations that are small or smallish. Those organizations that have well-defined processes, perhaps lower complexity. It is perfectly fine and perfectly acceptable to roll that out in a controlled way. We do it all the time and it's very successful, but it has to have the right controls. It does give you the ultimate flexibility because you can adapt very, very quickly. And there's really, if you think about it in terms of investment, it's something you already have in-house. And so it's a capability you can grow and nurture with the tools and the teams you have. Things you need to, of course, think about, things we've touched on, scalability. It's going to break at some point as you grow. If you have a lot of manual inputs, if there are a lot of assumptions that are being documented, where are they captured? You can attach an Excel spreadsheet to an email. It might be a beautiful document in the email. Once that hits the inbox and goes into a folder, you may never see that again. We have to have a central, have to have a way to track that. So that's one of the things to really think about. And then it is they are brittle when it comes to data issues, and we can talk a little bit about that. We talk about pre-built solutions. These are tools that are very specific to solve a specific business problem. Package-based solutions. Our perspective on these is that if you have a business process and structures and approaches that align very, very closely, almost exactly to pre-built solutions, then by all means, take a look at that. Like I said, if it adapts really well. But things to really be thinking about in the pre-built world is that once you go down that path, you are now locked into the assumptions that are being made by that particular provider on how the process should work. If you have nuances, maybe we're talking about customizations, which opens up the need for maintenance and proprietary code. Or maybe you're waiting for some item that's on the roadmap that may or may not get released out to the general user population. Again, things to think about. If it aligns well, by all means, they can be a good option. And the last is the EPM platform, which I mentioned earlier, highly customizable, flexible platforms that scale really well and are adaptable to your business process. It's probably, just based on what I've said so far, it probably comes as no surprise. We find this to be the most viable option for manufacturers. It's the one we've seen the most success with, especially in larger organizations as you scale up into larger and larger operations. So we spend a lot of our time working in the EPM space. Just a couple of key factors once you get started and once you go through it. One is data readiness. Again, talked about it already. There's a reason data is your foundation. I would argue it doesn't have to be perfect, so you don't want to make, like I said, what's the phrase? Don't make perfect the enemy of good. Excuse me. But we do need data ready and available to us. We have worked with manufacturers that are building that capability while we're standing up forecasting capabilities. And data readiness isn't just about if you're going the EPM or the package-based approach. Data readiness is also about making sure you're ready to go from any desktop capability. The second is organizational focus, and that is having individuals in the right spots who can help mandate, standardize, and push the organization where it needs to go. Everyone has their own opinions, and they're all, and we've seen it over and over again, individual forecasters or teams or brands that need to deal with their unique situations. That's absolutely reasonable and needs to be accounted for, but overall there needs to be a focus on how we're prioritizing the activities and how we're pushing forward. Time, that's a big one. We all have day jobs, and doing something like this, especially on the larger scale, is going to take a lot of time and effort. Folks need to be realistic about, and the organization needs to be realistic about what's possible, what kind of bandwidth do team members have, and can they be engaged at various points throughout the process. And when you're engaged with a partner, push to the partner and make sure they're helping you understand what does that look like. I mean, I can stand here and tell you that's what you need to do, but it's also, as a responsible partner, my job is to make sure that we're communicating with you as manufacturers and as clients to say, okay, we're going to need you here, we're going to need you here, we're going to need you here in these highly focused areas, a little bit less in these periods of time. And now we have to bounce that up against your regular responsibilities. That's a big part of it. And then finally, engage decision makers, another key item here. It can't be enough that, once a quarter somebody gets a steering committee deck or a high-level core team type presentation and makes a decision kind of in isolation. Decision makers and key influencers need to be engaged throughout the entire process. One of the things about best practices, you'll probably hear that over and over again. I know I don't know if I've sprinkled that throughout my talk so far, but to me there's a myth behind best practice that often gets part of the conversation, maybe unintentionally. I'm just going to keep it short, really. Best practice is really, it's not what the industry does in our perspective. They aren't predefined. If someone says, hey, you should do accruals this way, or you should forecast managed care this way, or you should deal with specialty pharmacy this way, that loses what makes each manufacturer and brand unique. That doesn't mean, though, that there are things out in the industry that work well that you shouldn't use. Best practices is knowing what does that look like? What does work well, and how do you adapt that appropriately? There are going to be some things that maybe you take exactly as it exists based on what you're hearing from colleagues out in the industry. But there may be, more often, what's going to happen is you're going to find things that others are doing. You're like, that sounds really good, let's adjust it. And the difference is making sure when you do best practice, what it truly means is, how do I adapt it the right way? And then finally, best practice, don't look for it in software. Predefined processes, when the tools were built, it might have been best practice, but it's only for that very specific circumstance. Take the same skeptical eye, say, yeah, that looks good. How do we make that work for us? How do we adapt it? How do we adjust it? It really isn't going to be strictly defined within software tools. All right, so this is the last part here. I've gone this entire time and I have not mentioned AI, but it is an important part of not only current activities as manufacturers explore what its capabilities are, but also where things are going in the future. Our perspective on this is that AI in general needs to have a specific objective to reach real outcomes. This quote here on the right, just a few months ago, it actually came out, it was in the Wall Street Journal, I don't know, maybe a week or two ago, that, and I'm sure you've seen it all over the news, companies are making these big splashes, huge investments in AI. Two things are happening. One, folks aren't actually getting much benefit out of that investment, especially when it's made just blanket, just use it for the sake of using it. In this case, an example, 18% of spending on AI tokens and processes barely translates into, only 18% is translating into something that is usable for end users. That's an incredible number. Think about the amount of money that's being thrown around in AI and in large companies. If that's a standard, being a standard statistic, less than 1 in 5 of operations is turning into real world use. So what does that mean? How do we apply AI, right? That's our problem here on the left. How do we apply AI that will work for the individuals in the process and return meaningful results? It's very confusing. There's a lot of different companies, a lot of different terms, a lot of different capabilities that are out there, and it's hard to identify. So our perspective is that treat AI almost like a coworker. Identify the business case that you need that individual to solve, and you hire that person into that role. And that's a pretty broad statement, but if you think about it, at the end of the day, what am I defining for my AI tools to do? They have a job to do. They're solving a business problem. Once I identify those, now how do I figure out, how do I train that platform? How do I make sure it has the access to the tools and capabilities I need? And how do I check its work? Just like any junior colleague, we have to mentor that colleague along in their career path. AI is no different. How do we get them there? And so I would encourage all of you to keep this in mind as you hear from either leadership or your teams, or you're exploring what can AI do for me in this process, and think of AI as a partner. And how can you engage that partner or coworker to help the organization forward? And that's all I have for today. I appreciate you taking the time. If there are any questions, happy to answer them. We are right there if you want to come visit on the other side, the Argano booth.